Well, that's quite the reading, isn't it? And I debated whether to include the whole thing, but I think it was good because the build-up to that confrontation with Goliath is quite extraordinary. And I think, and I also had reservations about, the armies and all this stuff that is there. But I think, Len, I don't know whether you'd agree with me, but I think it's actually a gospel about not really nonviolence or not trusting in militarism and arms. So there is that level to it. But at the same time, I do think it's probably one of the best known stories in the Hebrew scriptures after Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And it really resonates on both an individual and a social level. To me, it's a story of the vanquishing of almost impossible odds by an act of enormous courage. It's a story of the collapse of what seems, to all intents and purposes, an impregnable force by the action of an individual who's acting with courageous and faith-filled convictions. So I've been sort of mulling over this reading, and last Tuesday I was chopping up vegetables in the kitchen at All Saint Sherburne, along with a few other volunteers who were young enough really to be my grandchildren, which is great. It's lovely for me. It keeps me young. And I told them that I was preaching on David and Goliath and to pick their brains and say, what would you come up with in the contemporary world that would match this? Well, one of them, which I guess I shouldn't have been surprised, said, what is that story? So I thought, okay, that's fine. So I explained what it was. But then one of the others said, why don't you talk about the trans Stonewall riot, which a lot of people see as the start of the LGBTQ pride events and movements. And I thought, yeah, how to pride? Oh, Stonewall and the David in this story. Well, we're back in the 1950s. I'm sure most people do know this, but maybe it's refresh your memory a bit. We're back in the 60s, actually, 50s, and police raids on gay in parts of New York and elsewhere were absolutely routine. The Stonewall Inn was actually owned by the mafia, and it was known to be popular also with the poorest and the most marginalized communities in New York and in the gay community. There were a lot of drag queens who frequented it, and people from the very new, nascent sort of transgender community and homeless youth as well. So in those days, there wasn't a difference drawn between transvestite and transgender as there is now. They were all, I think, as far as I know, I've learned they were all part of what was called trans. Now, people in the neighborhood saw what was happening, and they decided to gather outside and watch. And the crowd grew, and gradually the police feared that they were losing control of the situation, which they'd never, ever done before. I mean, imagine Goliath and all the army, the weapons and everything that he said. He said, I'm losing control. This is too much for me. So they lost control. The police lost control, and they actually retreated. And that began a whole movement of places, bars and other places, who opened over the next few days and took in and supported the gay community and the homeless youth. It was kind of like the spark that lit the fire in that area, totally spontaneously, as was David's arrival at the scene. In this scene, Goliath had been taunting them, of course, and the police were known for taunting the community, of course, and encouraging him and so on. Anyway, there was an eyewitness to the riots who was out walking his dog, and he said, and I quote, "I had been in enough riots to know the fun in this one was over. The cops were totally humiliated." Still quoting, "This never, ever happened." They were so angry because everybody else could riot. But the fairies, and this I'm quoting, it's not my words, it's in the quote, the fairies were not supposed to riot. No group had ever forced the police to retreat before. So the anger was enormous and they were out to kill. And one of the participants was quoted in one of the newspaper articles I read, and I quote said, "We all had a collective feeling like we'd had enough of this shit." And that's in the quote. It wasn't anything tangible anybody said to anyone else. It was just like everything over the years came to a head in that one night. And it was not an organized demonstration. Everyone in the crowd felt we were never going to go back. It was time to reclaim something that had always been taken, from us. Our power, our inner power, our sense of ourselves, our sense of who we are. And we are viable and valid people in the eyes of God. That's not in the quote, that's my extemporizing. All kinds of people, I continue with the quote, all kinds of different reasons decided to go out and support the community. There was total outrage, anger, sorrow, everything combined. It was the police who were doing most of the destruction. We were trying to get back in and break free. We demanded freedom, just as David says, that I will trust in the right, in the power of God, in the power of freedom, in the ideals. It's like standing your ground for the first time. And that's what really caught the police by surprise. There was something in the air. We weren't going to go away, and we didn't. And there's a wonderful, the poet Allen Ginsberg wrote at the time, and I quote, "You know, the guys that were there were so beautiful. They lost that wounded look that they had all had for 10 years. That wounded look. For 40 days, we're told in the reading from Samuel, for 40 days, Goliath came forth and took his stand, and the Israelites fled from him and were very much afraid. A wounded look certainly overcame them, but that was about to change. When David came to Saul, he said, 'Let no one's heart fail because of Goliath. Your servant will go out and fight the Philistine.' And then there follows the kind of statement where David says, 'I've had enough of this. Time to lose the wounded look.' So it's a great reading. I love it. And we don't get it very often in the course of the year. But you see, hasn't this church had a long history of standing up like a David to various Goliaths? And I think of Jim Ferry, who's not here today, but he graces our services once a month, of course. It's more than 20 years since Jim was made an outcast by the previous Bishop of Toronto and the late Bishop, Terry Finley, for being in a same-sex relationship. But Jim never, during all those 20 years, surrendered his integrity. He never adopted what Allen Ginsberg calls the wounded look. And look at him today. He doesn't have that wounded look. Because in 2011, his license as a priest was reinstated by Archbishop Colin Johnson. And I certainly consider it a privilege to serve here in this church alongside Jim, who is, to my mind, one of the great examples of a David against and overcoming a Goliath. All of us, you see, who are here today and online and the wider community that we serve, all of us who believe in the power of progressive causes like nonviolence, climate change, welcoming refugees, we all feel, don't we? Certainly I do, at times, that the powers of hateful violence and suppression ranged against us are gargantuan, Goliath-like. And we even think, I mean, I often think, like, to refer to the gospel of today, where is God? You know, God's asleep. Even God seems to be asleep when we're in this rickety little boat trying to cross the Lake of Galilee when the storms rage all around us. But we still have the power of the Spirit. We still can trust that the power of that Spirit who is with us, often unseen and often seemingly asleep, but still, the mystics say, you know, when it's sleeping or the dark night of the soul, that is the time when God is really active, and you have to trust God. And so even one step taken in the right direction of resistance is powerful. In ancient times, a tale was told of a mighty giant, strong and bold. Goliath was his name renowned, feared by all on the battleground. With spear and shield, he stood so tall, a towering force above them all. This is a poem, by the way, I found that was written in 2023. I found it online. So I thought, hey, I'm going to use this. Good one. So it continued. Challenging all with pompous might, Goliath's foes quaked in dread and fright. But in the midst of fear and doubt, a young boy stepped with courage stout. David, his name, a shepherd lad, with a slingshot in his hand he had. Against the giant, he took his stand, unfazed by size. With God's command, a stone he hurled, with aim so true, striking Goliath, the giant slew. The crowds were stunned. In awe they stared as David triumphed and Goliath fell. A lesson learned for all to see, that valor and faith can set you free. For even when the odds seem dire, with unwavering faith, we can aspire to overcome the giants, big or small, and rise victorious, standing tall. May it be so. Amen.